Behold, I have created the earth and what is in it, and all that are living in it. I have created you and given you your daily bread. Your living is in my hands, and your death too. I will excuse you and send you to my paradise. Put your trust in me, and forget about the God who is in heaven. But you will be cast into hell forever if you worship the God who is in heaven anymore. Behold, my wrath is going to fall upon you. It is waiting only for an answer from you. Turn your souls from the heavenly God quickly. Lionish-God, Irradiant, excerpt via R.C. Zaehner. Good evening, everybody. Wow, I've been wanting to do this video for a while now, just because I've been wondering how I would do it. But I think what I shall do is probably, I don't know, maybe I'll do, or maybe someone will do an actual audio book of it. The thing is, it's not really the entirety of the story. So what's interesting is I found this while reading this article. I don't know how I got to this article, but what really stood out was this little part right here, and this is that just piqued my interest, because it's like, wow, it's very, like, I've been kind of going into the Zoroastrianism, pre-Zoroastrian era, Mithras, and then of course, which kind of got switched over to like the Roman Mithra cult, Mithraism, and it just, things get really complicated and confusing. And this one is someone from the province of Irradiant in Iran, back in I think when I read it, you'll know it's back in the mid 20th century. He worked for R.C. Zaehner for 6 weeks, and he was really learning English so he could write, and then he was just doing as much as he could to write a story. One of the things he wrote was that was actually published, is No Heaven for Gunga Din. And I think they made a movie for it, and the author is tribute to Ali Mirdrakvandi. And I spelled the name wrong, I think. Yeah, I did. Damn it! I'll have to edit the video. But he also wrote a very big epic that was probably like handed down, like told through just nighttime stories and things like that, passed on from probably his father, his grandfather, grandmother, who knows. And because he was learning English, they're both written in broken English. And so the interesting thing is this big epic, Irradiant, ends up not being published. I think there's 2 authors that review the work of R.C. Zaehner as far as the Ali Mirdrakvandi. I don't know how to say that. And it is amazing. I think it is something very rare. It's something very not known about. I've never heard any podcast talk about it. I've never listened to any esotericist or occultist or historian or mythologist, whatever, talk about this epic called Irradiant. And what's fascinating about it is it ties in very much with Gnosticism and Zoroastrianism and even Mithraism, in some ways, not always, but there's that missing link, I guess, and it's I even can probably make it analogous to the Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, actually, not the Lord of the Rings, and I think I can see how Lord of the Ring or the whole Silmarillion, the entirety of that epic was based on a lot of mythology and not. I mean, there's so much to talk about. So, what I want to go over here, since this is where I started, I'll just kind of go from here. Most interestingly, in Iran, in the province of Liristan, a tale recounts the existence of an evil deity. This can be translated as the Lionish-God. R.C. Zaehner, who saw the manuscript of this tale, provides the following excerpt in which the Lionish-God states. And then that's the quote of the day, pretty much. It's in the description link, description box. This could in some ways be corroborated by the symbolism of serpents in the Yazidi mystery cult prominent in northern Iraq and Armenia, and is depicted on the walls of the sanctuary of Sheikh Adib. It is never explicitly mentioned in Yazidi literature. Its function is probably most closely related to the older Gnostic understanding of the black snake as the destructive creator functionary in the world. And so, I mean, I'm pretty sure a lot of people who's done a little bit of studying, right, in mythology and Gnosticism, kind of understand the demiurge, as in the Gnostic demiurge, and this is usually the depiction of it with a lion-headed body and serpent body, and I wonder. I recently watched Raised by Wolves with my wife, and it's kind of similar to the origin of the demiurge type of thing, but in its own little stint. But this Irradiant goes to a whole new level when you just read about it, and I'll probably be going back and forth because the written work, at least the Zaehner manuscript on the Irradiant, kind of references the Vatican Museum, because the Vatican Museum has this in it. You know, you would think, why does the Vatican Museum have the demiurge or the Lionish-God depiction? The lion head, snake, wings, and you've got some what is it? The 12 constellations, the zodiacs. A few of them attached. And if you don't know about the demiurge or the architect with Gnosticism, you can easily find it everywhere. And usually the association isn't in like evil. It's more of the demiurge is more ignorant. That's usually just what is mostly described as the demiurge. In Gnostic, one of the Gnostic folklores, basically, Sophia ends up creating, without the aid of her partner, and ended up creating Demiurge, who woke up in the place that she created for him, and he goes, well, I'm the only one here, so I must be the creator of this world, and all this stuff, and yeah, it's pretty ignorant. And You'll notice that in Irradiant, it's very much the same. He's mostly ignorant, very much a destructor, creator, and it's fascinating. Because it really represents where we're at, right? If we look at how the system is with the authority, wants you to submit, basically submit to not knowing about what's beyond. Even scientism, they go, there's no such thing as higher consciousness. This is all there is. The atheist belief mindset. You've got the big three, the Abrahamic religions with Judaism, Christianity, and Muslimism, Islamic religion. Sorry. You can see that they're very much about worshiping this deity who's very commanding about that you should worship him, right? And when we get to Gnosticism and some of the ideas of the Jesus Christ figure within the Gnostic Christians, and Zoroastrianism and like early pre-Roman Mithraism, the Mithras religion, I guess you could say. I don't know how to differentiate those two different time periods of the religious aspects of Mithra. Anyways, the idea is their worship is of just a creator only deity that creates perfection. I mean, if we look at this world, we see some bad parts of nature. We see some great parts of nature, but we also see some negative aspects of nature, and how we're partaking in it. And there's a lot of misery in this world, a lot of pain, a lot of death, but there's also a lot of good things to it as well. So the idea of this heavenly God, creator, and Irradiant is it's a creator, very peaceful God. Truth is its utmost importance. And then you've got the opposite, which is the Lionish-God. And in short, I think I'll start talking about this. Zoroastrian survivals in Iranian folklore. Author is R.C. Zaehner. There's also part 2 by a different author who just kind of reflects on what R.C. Zaehner wrote. And what's difficult is, since, as far as I know, Irradiant wasn't published, so I can't really read the original. And if there is a publication of Irradiant, it's not in its original Persian, it's just a translation from Persian. Although that doesn't make sense when the second author talks about it, because R.C. Zaehner says it's written in broken English. So I think what the second author is trying to say is they want to find like the original story that's written in Persian, and not Ali Mirdrakvandi's translation of that story into broken English. So I think that's what it is, and so far there hasn't been. And if there is, man, you've got another. I'm pretty sure someone out there is going to be watching this, even though I don't get a lot of views, and they're going to be like, wow, I think I'm going to write the next epic here. It's going to surpass Lord of the Rings. And it can be. The thing is, it will probably piss a lot of people off, a lot of religious people who are probably unknowingly worshiping the Lionish-God. And they don't want to think that way, right? Okay, so the idea, we'll go through a lot of this. I think what I'll probably end up doing is actually reading it. And it's not that long. It's right now on the PDF. It's page 23. This first part by R.C. Zaehner is just, I think, half of it, and then the second half is part 2 by a different author that kind of tries to tie it in together and see how it relates to like the Brindishism. I can't say it correct, right? The basically Zoroastrian and pre-Zoroastrian, everything I was talking about, telling you to all these different religion or cults or whatever you want to call it, spiritual. I don't know. But so in essence, the Lionish-God is just the dark, right? The evil, not quite evil, just ignorant. There is a brother to the Lionish-God called the Devil, who is evil, and kind of helps. And what happens is the Lionish-God just attacks heaven and tries to say, "Look, I am the one and only God, and I'll prove to you that you're nothing to the heavenly God." And the heavenly God isn't seen. There's only angels that support him. There's no weapons or anything like that. But like this first attack fails miserably. The second attack also fails, and I think there's one last attack, the third attack, where he finally falls and is unconscious for like 3,000 years. And during this time, he realizes, well, I'm never going to be able to defeat heavenly gods. So, he's kind of depressed. And then his brother, the Devil, comes around and says, well, since you can't defeat him, what you can do is ruin his creation, right? And turn everyone who believes in him in this realm that you control to worship you and not the heavenly God. And so that's what he ends up doing. And that's kind of where you see a lot of true believers, is many pacifists, I guess, just really sorry that people just kind of got misled into worshiping this Lionish-God rather than the heavenly God. And it's just weird to know that there are these people out there, and I don't know if I could ever be as good as them as far as being pacifist in that way. I would probably do a lot of things that, in defense of violence, right? But who knows? Maybe I'll just be like, all right, bring it, man. I'm dead, whatever. So let's just get on with this because it's fascinating. I think you can probably find it. I download it. You can go to JSTOR. You have to log in. You have to register, log in, and you have to purchase it. But I found this on some archive site. I don't know exactly where, but basically I was able to find this manuscript and downloaded it. And I want to find more. I think I would love to, if I cannot piece it together, if I cannot find it to publish it, I think I may just try to do like a different rendition of it, just retelling of a retelling of a retelling. It's like the telephone game. But it's imaginative. I think part of the second author that writes about, I guess it's kind of like not quite a critic, but like a critic slash, where's this imagination storyline coming from, and what's it trying to mean ultimately, right? And but it's very imaginative. Like they don't really care about all the fighting because it's not really exciting. But the next turn of events of like, oh well, since I can't win, what else can I do? It's like, oh wow, yeah, that makes sense, and that's a really good part. I enjoy it. It's I can't think of any television series or movie that really does this. Like, this story isn't told. Right? We usually get in TV series and movies just the same story kind of rehashed. Um, but this one has never really been told, and I think it should be. All right, so here it is: Zoroastrian Survivals in Iranian Folklore by R.C. Zaehner. Visitors to the Vatican Museum in Rome will remember that the very first monuments flanking the entrance to the first room in the vast gallery that leads ultimately to the Sistine Chapel are neither saints, not angels, but what appear to be devils. For at each side of the entrance door, guarding it with their baleful presence, stand two most unchristian deities with the head of a lion and gaping jaws. In both hands they bear keys, a snake encircles their bodies, and signs of the zodiac are impressed on their limbs. Coming face to face with these awesome figures, Christians may well recall the words of St. Peter. Be sober and watch, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, goeth about seeking whom he may devour. The serpent, too, which envelops the body of the lion-headed deity, is all too familiar, and one is tempted to identify it with that self-same serpent which tempted our first mother Eve to eat of the forbidden fruit. Yet interestingly, though the Christian parallels may be, we have long known that this rather repulsive deity has nothing to do with the Christian devil, for he figured in a cult that was for long Christianity's most potent rival in the early Roman Empire. This rival religion, which has left monuments throughout the length and breadth of the Roman Empire, is known as Mithraism, and its roots were originally in Iran. For the god Mithra, from whom the new Persian word mer, meaning both the sun and affection, derives, was in the Zoroastrianism of the later Achaemenian Empire, second only to the supreme deity Ahura Mazda itself. Everything in the history of Zoroastrianism is obscure, and not least the relationship between the Mithraism so widely practiced in the Roman Empire and the varieties of Zoroastrianism we must assume to have existed in Iran. With the central figure of Mithras himself, we are not for the present concerned, though the role of Mithras in the Mithraic mysteries is quite different from that of the genuinely Iranian god Mithra of the later Avesta. At least we know that the Roman Mithras, whose slaying of a bull and sacrifice is recorded in innumerable monuments, must ultimately derive from the Iranian Mithra, the divine guardian of the compact, if for no other reason than the name is the same. The lion-headed deity, however, who next to Mithras himself is the most frequently met with among all the deities of the Mithraic pantheon, was until quite recently a much more puzzling figure. The great Belgian scholar Frans Cumont had identified this sinister figure with the Iranian god of time and fate, Zervan, largely because the statues are often adorned with the signs of the zodiac. And such was the scholar's immense prestige that lesser men followed all too tamely in his footsteps. It was left to another Belgian, Professor Jacques du Casguillemin, and myself to point out that this truly diabolical god can scarcely have been other than the Zoroastrian devil Ahriman, however surprising that might seem to be. Among the various dedications to Mithraic deities that survive, there are none to Zervan or to any corresponding Roman god of time or fate, but quite a number Deo Arimanio to the god Ahriman. Common self should have told us long ago that the gaping lion-headed monster must in fact be Ahriman himself. As I then wrote, it seems to me certain that the god represented is not Zervan, as Cumont had supposed, but Ahriman. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what Zervan is, Zervan, think of it as the Tao, the original creator, the source, whatever, right? That's Zervan. It would seem inconceivable that this deity, which is more frequent occurrence than any except the Mithras Taraktanos himself, should be mentioned in any Mithraic dedication. Prima facie, then the lion-headed deity whose body is encircled by a snake represented Deus Ahrimanius, to whom votive tablets are dedicated. that there should be no dedications at all to a deity which obviously played an extremely important part in the cult seems incredible. And of the deities to which votive tablets are dedicated, none can conceivably be the Leontocephalus monster except Arminius Ahriman. I always find it interesting that Ahriman sounds so much like Saruman in Lord of the Rings. Mithraism, however, though it is unquestionably of Iranian origin, differs so radically from any form of Zoroastrianism we know of in the Iranian sources that we have to look for possible affiliations elsewhere. What indeed distinguishes Mithraism from the main forms of Zoroastrianism we know from the Avesta, the Pahlavi books, and the later Zoroastrianism sources written in New Persian is the cult it offers to Ahriman. To a Zoroastrian, to offer homage to such a being would be as unthinkable as it would be for a Muslim, whether Shi'i or Sunni, to prostrate himself to Iblis. Yet we know that there were persons claiming to be Zoroastrians who did precisely this, for we read in Plutarch's De Acid et Oserid. Sorry if I cannot pronounce a lot of these things. Some Iranians, he writes, recognize two gods as it were rival artificers, the one the creator of good things, the other of bad. But others call the better God, and the other a demon, as does Zoroaster the Magus. He called the one Hormazd, most people pronounce it as Hormazda. So sorry if I say it as Hormazd and not Hormazda, just because Hormazd just comes out quicker, right? And the other Ahriman. And he showed too that all of the sensible things, the former resembled chiefly light, but the latter on the other hand resembled darkness and ignorance. Between the two is Mithras, wherefore the Persians also called Mithras the mediator. And he taught them to sacrifice to the one votive offerings and thanks offerings, but to the other offerings for averting evil, things of gloom. Theologically, this corresponds fairly closely to what we learn from the Pahlavi books, but the cult offered to Ahriman, even for the understandable purpose of averting evil, was absolutely anathema to any Orthodox Zoroastrian. Of all sins, the propitiation of Ahriman and his attendant demons was considered to be the worst. What Plutarch calls the teaching of Zoroaster was in fact abhorred by Zoroastrian orthodoxy. It is what the Zoroastrian text called Devashni, or devil worship. This is frequently mentioned and condemned in the Pahlavi books, but we learn very little from them about the actual beliefs and practices of these much persecuted people. Thus, I wrote in 1955, in seeking to interpret Mithraism against the background of these devil worshippers, we run the risk of seeking to explain the unknown from the unknown. It is, however, legitimate, I added, to see in the Mandaeans and Yazidis of Iraq and in the Al-Haq of Kurdistan remote survivors of precisely such a religion. It is true that the Al-Haq texts appear in Shia, or more precisely Ali Ilahi guise, but the pagan substructure still shows clearly through. This hunch, the light might one day be thrown both on what the Zoroastrians call demon worship and on Mithraism, which seemed to be a Western offshoot of it, has recently been confirmed in a quite extraordinary way, for I now have in my rooms in Oxford an enormous work which can only be described as a popular epic and which, so far as I know, has never before been written down. It originates in Liristan. Just how this remarkable work came into my hands is so peculiar and so full of coincidence that I must recount it in some detail. The story begins at the end of the last war when I was working in the British Embassy in Tehran, and when to my immense regret now, my thoughts were no longer directed towards Zoroastrianism, let alone to the folklore of Liristan, of which I in any case knew nothing and in which at that time I had no interest. When the British and American armies left Iran, a whole mass of servants and menial workers were temporarily thrown out of work, and their former employers naturally tried to find jobs for them with those of their compatriots who remained in Iran. One such person came my way, and although I did not really have any employment to offer, so remarkable was he that I took him on as an extra houseboy. In appearance, there was nothing extraordinary about him. He came from a village called Raykan in southern Luristan. Throughout the war, he had taken on odd jobs with American or British units in Tehran, but he never seemed to stay long, as he had often to return to Luristan to help his family out there with what money he had earned in the capital. What, however, distinguished him from the vast majority of his own kind, for it must be remembered he came from a very poor peasant family, was not only was he wholly literate in Persian, but in the course of the war years he had become literate in English too. I do not mean that he had picked up a word or two in his day-to-day dealings with the Americans and British. No, he had painstakingly taught himself the language with practically no assistance from outside. And this was not all. When he came to my notice, he was engaged in writing what appeared to be a very long novel in English, and he had already written some 100,000 words. Now, one might have supposed that with these astonishing linguistic achievements to his credit, he might have sought a clerical job, but he never did. On the contrary, he had a strong aversion to clerical work of any kind, and an even stronger one for the kind of person normally employed on this type of work. Being very much of the earth, he deeply mistrusted the townsmen. This made him somewhat antisocial and incapable of cooperating with others who were on the surface so much more polished than himself. Of his personal appearance, he took no care whatever, and this made it extremely difficult to fit him in. In fact, he only stayed with me about 6 weeks and then simply vanished. I have never seen him again. During this short time, however, he did occasionally consult me about his novel. In English, it was called Irradiant. The Persian, as I have subsequently learned, was Mirdrakvandi, which was the hero's name. Another prominent character in the book had the evocative name of Chandelier. Here again, we happen to know that the original Persian was Shahal. The basis of this story, I imagined correctly, must derive from folklore, and the names certainly suggested an ultimately Zoroastrian origin, some version, that is, of a struggle between the powers of light and the powers of darkness. However, the author, Ali Mirdrakvandi, for such was his name, disappeared, taking the unfinished manuscript with him, and I thought no more about it. Fortunately, a former employer and friend of Mirdrakvandi had been more farsighted than myself. This was Mr. J.F.B. Hemming, now resident in Cornwall, who had been in touch with him for much of the war. Mirdrakvandi was literally obsessed with the idea of learning English, and Mr. Hemming used to correct the letters he sent to him from time to time. These became longer and longer, so that Mr. Hemming finally asked him whether he didn't know a story he could write for him in English. He replied yes, he did know one story. This was Irradiant, and by the time Mr. Hemming left, I ran. Less than half the story had been actually written. Arrangements, however, were made by which the story was to be sent on in installments to England. In the end, the book was completed, and Mr. Hemming found himself with a colossal manuscript of nearly 400,000 words, not knowing what, if anything, could be done with it. With the paper shortage prevailing after the war, plainly the publication of so immense a work was out of the question, so it had to be put away in cold storage. Meanwhile, he continued to correspond with Mirdrakvandi, but no letter has been received from him since 1949. Whether he is still alive, we do not know, and this is, of course, one of the things I should still like to ascertain. Here the story might have ended, but in the autumn of 1963, Mr. Hemming again bethought himself on the mammoth manuscript in his charge, and started to make inquiries at the London School of Oriental and African Studies as to whether this material had any academic interest, and so in due course I received a letter from him. I was immediately interested because, first because I too had known Ali Mirdrakvandi at first hand, and secondly because I thought that Irradiant might contain material which would help to illumine some of the knottier Zoroastrian problems. I confess that I was not over optimistic, and the first installment I received seemed to be no more than a very good, extraordinarily imaginative fairy tale with very little religious significance. I had hoped for something along the lines of the Ali-i-Haq tales published by Ivanhoe, and I was disappointed that Irradiant, or Mirdrakvandi, contained no obvious religious myth as the Kurdish tales did. Mirdrakvandi, despite his name, was no incarnation of the sun god as other heroes did the Ali-Haq tales, but simply the son of a very poor and very aged parents in the best fairy tale tradition. When I reached book 2, however, I began to rub my eyes, for the first words I read were these: The Lionish-God was sitting on his throne, and his crown on his head. His orb was sitting in his left hand. All the prophets of high rank were sitting behind him, every one in his own place. Well, this certainly seemed interesting. In 1955, I and Professor Duchesne Guillaumin had suggested that the prototype of the lion-headed god in Mithraism was the Zoroastrian Ahriman, and sure I had stumbled into a Lionish god sitting on his throne and his crown on his head. Surely, I thought, this must be Ahriman himself surviving in a folktale. Before proceeding any further, I must say a few words about the setting of the story. In Book 1, I have so far heard nothing about Lionish-God. All we know is that there are two religions practiced in the country in which Irradiant was born. These are called respectively deists or true believers on the one hand and heathens on the other. In Persian, this would presumably be Yazdan Paristan or Mo'menin on the other hand, and Kafar or Kafiran on the other. All this, of course, might very well be Muslim, and the heathens might represent any non-Muslim or pre-Muslim sect. For so far, we have been told very little about the beliefs of either religion. We are, however, told that the heathens are also worshippers of Satan. This puts us in mind of the Yazidis, popularly called devil worshippers by their enemies. Not very much is known about their beliefs except that they pay special honor to a peacock angel, or peacock of the angels, whom their enemies identify with Satan and who is most beautiful. In Irradiant, at the end of the first of the many wars of which this epic tells, when the unbelievers have been conquered, most of the vanquished submit and agree to give up the worship of Satan, and to turn to the worship of the true God who dwells in heaven. One very old man, however, refuses. "Why don't you believe in God who is in heaven, when all your fellows have done?" asked the king. "My fellows are foolish, but I am not. I have seen the Satan with my eyes. He is more beautiful than Irradiant. He can be seen, but your God who is in heaven can't be seen." This myth is certainly of Semitic origin, Satan being Lucifer, the bringer of light, whose fall is occasioned by his refusal to serve God. In Mohammedan tradition, Satan is sometimes spoken of as having been designated to rule the lowest heaven, and he was only deprived of this dignity when he refused to bow down to Adam. Worship of a most beautiful Satan is thus easily explained from the Mohammedan tradition itself. Satan is a Semitic devil with nothing Iranian or Zoroastrian about him. In Book 2, however, we come to know Lionish-God, who, as we shall see, is almost certainly a survival of the Iranian devil Ahriman. And it's somewhat surprising then that we are told that Satan and Lionish-God are in fact brothers. This is, however, the way religious syncretism works. Old ideas are dressed up in new forms, and the most surprising identifications take place. Before we try to explain this surprising conjunction, however, we must return to the plot of the story. Irradiant is born of very aged and very poor parents who are true believers, and they live in a predominantly heathen country whose king is a heathen. Before I interject, the heathen in most Christian is usually used in mostly Christian terms, or the Abrahamic religions, because Muslims use them too. But in this case, it's not necessarily that, because things are reversed. Okay, so keep that in mind. They are persecuted and imprisoned, but Irradiant escapes, and after a long series of adventures, he overthrows and kills the king and makes his father king in his place. Before doing this, however, he overthrows the king of a neighboring country, who becomes a true believer, destroys the king of a third heathen country, and makes an innkeeper who had befriended him and who is himself a true believer king, and saves what at this stage of the story is the only country of true believers from an enchantment which had literally paralyzed his queen and all her subjects. With these allies, he overthrows the king who had persecuted his parents and makes his own father king in his place. At this point, one would have thought the story would naturally come to an end. It is, however, only the prelude to a far more titanic struggle between Irradiant and his allies on the one hand, and Lionish-God, of whose very existence we were ignorant throughout Book 1, on the other. Book 2, as we have seen, opens with Lionish-God sitting on his throne with his crown upon his head. This is the first we have heard of Lionish-God, and though in the first book we have met with all manner of supernatural creatures, demons, hags, satyrs, and so on. None of these is ever referred to as a god. Lionish-God, on the other hand, is repeatedly called God and refers to himself as the creator. Moreover, he is surrounded by what appears to be an angelic court, for read on. Gabriel prostrated himself before Lionish-God, and he said, "Thou certainly knowest that who is standing outside thy high palace." "Yes, I know who he is, but I'd like you to tell me," replied Lionish-God. Now, there are 2 points worth noticing here. First, what is the angel Gabriel doing in the company of Lionish-God? And secondly, why does Lionish-God, who is believed to be omniscient, still insist on being told who is outside the palace? The answer to the second question is that he has to ask because he is not really omniscient and only believes himself to be so. The significance of this will become clearer later. The presence of Gabriel presents further problems, the answers to which is not plain. Lionish-God, as I hope to show, is really related to the lion-headed deity of Mithraism and is therefore the lineal descendancy of the Zoroastrian Ahriman. Does this mean that the original authors of the epic wished thereby to identify their own Ahriman with the god of the conquering Muslims? It is very hard to say, since there are obviously level upon level of interpolation and addition within the main story, and one of these at least is Muslim, since the true believers give the Quranic account of Satan's refusal to pay homage to Adam, and later in the book, the true Gabriel turns up in the presence of Lionish-God's rival, Heavenly God. Excuse me, sometimes when I talk a lot, I burp. To return to the second point, however, Lionish-God claims to be omniscient, but in fact he knows very little even of what is going on in his own kingdom. Similarly, the Zoroastrian Ahriman is described as a Dan, without knowledge, and as Dusakas, evilly conscious. He deceives himself into believing that he is omnipotent and omniscient. So too, in Irradiant, the fall of Lionish-God is largely due to gradual realization among his subjects that he is in fact neither omniscient nor omnipotent. These resemblances may not amount to very much, but there are further resemblances which are very striking indeed. In Irradiant, there are 2 gods. The true one, Heavenly God, who is the creator of heaven and earth and dwells in heaven and is invisible. And the false one, Lionish-God, whose realm is this earth, who believes himself to be omnipotent and omniscient, and who claims to be creator of the earth but not of heaven. In the Zoroastrian creation myth, we have 2 gods. Ormazd, who dwells in the lights on high, and Ahriman, who dwells in the darkness in the depths. The chief difference, of course, between the 2 accounts is that the Zoroastrian Ahriman dwells in eternal darkness, while Lionish-God is represented as being an earthly king. Yet I think that there's more to it than this, for it is quite clear that Irradiant reflects a form of Zoroastrian that is by no means orthodox, a form that allowed very much more power to Ahriman than is allowed to him either in the Avesta or in the Pahlavi books. This appears to have been the case in Mithraism too, for on many of the statues of the Mithraic lion-headed deity, the signs of the zodiac are embossed, and almost invariably the sinister deity holds a key in each hand. The symbolism of this appears to be that this god controls the fate of the world through the heavenly bodies, and that he holds the keys of heaven too. He is then a malign power that keeps the soul imprisoned in the world and prevents it from rising up to heaven. Ahriman then in the Mithraic system is the prince of this world. I'm going to stop there for a second because that really does reflect very much Gnosticism. Right, Gnosticism kind of grew a lot when The Matrix was released, and it's a lot of movies that kind of depict Gnosticism as much as yeah. Anyways, but this also, I remember listening to. Or was it reading about this one religion in somewhere in Northern Europe? Maybe it's Serbian paganism. That their god, or one of their gods, not the highest god, whatever you want to call it, the heavenly god, but one of their gods controls the world and swaps people's souls with different bodies. And keeps them in this world, right? I mean, it's a mean thing to do, I would say, right? But it's the same thing. We have this deity that seems to control Earth, and keeps everyone imprisoned here. Ah, so I just think that's fascinating. That it's that this I keep wanting to say motif, but this entire idea uh, is in this town in Iran, Luristan, from this poor person from poor parents in a poor village, right? And it's fascinating. Oh shoot! Hold on. Oh man, hate that. Sometimes there's flies here in the basement. I don't know how they survive. They just kind of reawaken from hibernation or something. All right, sorry for that segue. This idea is not unknown in other sources, for we read in the Muslim hagiographer Shahristani that according to one sect of the Zoroastrians, the Zervanites, Ahriman did in fact master the world, and that for a time Ormazd had no power against him. Again, according to the Armenian Christian polemist Esnik of Kolb, Ahriman rules the world for 9,000 years, while Ormazd rules above him, presumably in heaven. The one is king in time, the other in eternity. In the Pahlavi sources themselves, the measure of earthly power is granted to Ahriman, though he never really has a chance of winning. Another stoppage here. We're going to see the 9,000 years thing in Irradiant, and just remember that. Ormazd knew, according to the Bunda Hizn, I want to know how that's pronounced because it sounds very much like Buddhism, doesn't it? Bunda Hizn. Ormazd knew in his omniscience that within these 9,000 years, 3,000 would pass entirely according the will of Ormazd, 3,000 would pass according to the will of both Ormazd and Ahriman, and that in the last battle, the destructive spirit would be made powerless, and that he himself would save creation from aggression. This pattern is precisely what we find in Irradiant. Before passing on to that, however, we must describe the original state of existence as found in Zoroastrian mythology, and see how oddly this same situation reappears in the form of a fairy tale in Irradiant. In both, the scene is dominated by two rival gods, the one good and the other evil. The situation in the Zoroastrian myth is described by the Bundahishan in this way. Ormazd was on high in omniscience and goodness. For infinite time he was ever in the light. The light is the space and place of Ormazd. Some call it the endless light. Omniscience and goodness are the totality of Ormazd. Ahriman, slow in knowledge, whose will is to smite, was deep down into darkness. He was and is, yet will not be. The will to smite is his all, and darkness is his place. Some call it the eternal darkness, or the endless darkness. Similarly, in Irradiant, heavenly God is depicted as dwelling above in heaven. Lionish-God, just like the Mithraic rather than the Zoroastrian Ahriman, holds sway here below on earth. Further, just as Ahriman is slow in knowledge, so is Lionish-God, extremely badly informed. He lays claim to omniscience, yet always has to ask what is going on. He knows little, and what little he knows too late. Again, like Ormazd, heavenly God was and is and evermore shall be, whereas Lionish-God was and is, yet shall not be. For he is slain by Irradiant at the end of the story with his own sword. I can stop there for a second. That is very, very much like like the Silmarillion, and how what's his name comes back to just the leading dark. Gosh, gotta brush up on my Lord of the Rings, and is slain by an elf with this special sword. So maybe this person, I don't know. I let me just continue reading it. But isn't it amazing how this is very I don't know. This is just amazing little piece. I wish I could read that 400,000 word epic. Uh, here we go. Ahriman, of course, being eternal in time past, believes himself also to be eternal in time future, and this view is shared by Lionish-God and Irradiant. For his daughter, who bears the astonishing name of Twinkling Starlet, says of him, "My father has been reigning for the past 100 years. He will reign forever, and he will never die." So far, the resemblances are astonishingly close. Let's see how the Zoroastrian myth goes on. Ormazd, in his omniscience, knew that Ahriman existed and that he would attack, and since his will is envy, would mingle with him, and from the beginning to the end he knew with what and how many instruments he would accomplish this purpose. In ideal form he fashioned for such creation as was needful. Ahriman, ever slow to know, was unaware of the existence of Ormazd. Then he rose up from the depths and went to the border from whence the lights are seen. When he saw the light of Ormazd intangible, he rushed forward. Because his will is to smite, and his substance is envy, he made haste to destroy it. Seeing valor and supremacy superior to his own, he fled back to the darkness and fashioned many demons, a creation destructive and met for battle. Excuse me. Again, very much like Lord of the Rings. Man, I need to tap in just because it's really killing me why I can't seem to recall certain names. Malcor. That's who I was thinking of. So I didn't even see it. It's like something popped in my head. All right. Wow. All right. So Ahriman then, once he comes to know of Armad's existence, sets out to destroy him. But before doing so, he makes a preliminary reconnaissance at the borders of Armad's heavenly realm, which, it should be noted, is intangible. This too is faithfully reflected in Irradiant. There is not indeed explicitly stated that Lionish-God does not know the existence of heavenly gods, since in the fairy tale the episode does not take place at the beginning of time. But the Zoroastrian story of the two gods preparing their instruments for the battle does reappear, for Lionish-God, after his attack on heaven has failed, says, "Heavenly God has set himself against me from old days, and also he has prepared all the instruments of war on me." This recalls the Bundahishan phrase, "In ideal form he fashioned for such creation as was needful." Let us return to the Bundahishan to see how the situation between the two gods developed there. Each has now created a spiritual armament with which to combat the other, but the difference between the two is that whereas Ahriman is bent on destroying Ormazd and his whole creation, Ormazd in his goodness desires only peace. And so Ormazd, knowing in what manner the end would be, offered peace to Ahriman, saying, "O Ahriman, bring aid to my creation and give it praise, that in reward therefore thou mayest be deathless and unaging, uncorrupting and undecaying. And the reason is this, that if thou dost not provoke a battle, thou shalt not thyself be powerless, and to both of us there shall be benefit abounding." But Ahriman cried out, "I will not bring aid to thy creation, nor will I give it praise, but I shall destroy thee and thy creation forever and ever. Yea, I shall incline all thy creatures to hatred of thee and love of me." And the interpretation thereof is this, that he thought Ormazd was helpless against him, and that therefore did he offer peace. He accepted, not only offered threats. And Ormazd said, "Thou canst not, O Ahriman, accomplish all, nor canst thou bring it about that my creation should not return to my possession." All this reappears in closely parallel form in Irradiant. Lionish-God attacks heaven on two occasions. The first attack seems to correspond to the preliminary reconnaissance of the kingdom of light by Ahriman, to which we have already referred. God's spiritual creation, as we have seen, is intangible, and this too emerges from Irradiant. As Lionish-God prepares his attack, a false friend urges him on in these words: "Thou surely wilt destroy the heavenly God and conquer heaven if thou settest thy armies against him. For the heavenly God has no armies. He hath only several bands of angels. The angels have no armor, nor can they fight. They can only worship their God and praise him. This exactly corresponds to Arma's belief that Armaz was helpless against him and that therefore he did offer peace. Lionish-God's treacherous advisor, however, failed to point out that heavenly God's creatures in heaven were spiritual beings, and therefore, as the Bunda too has it intangible. This is demonstrated in the most vivid way when the attack actually takes place. They went to heaven with all speed. 10 hours passed. They reached a place where they could not see the earth anymore, either by their telescope or by the magnifier. 25 hours passed. They reached the air where they could see the sun no more, nor could they see the moon either, or the stars. The Lionish-God was exceedingly angry. His commander said to him, "Thy godly knowledge is much greater than is any of ours. But we think that the heaven has been taken away, and the heavenly God has escaped himself." "I think so," replied the Lionish-God, and his angerness increased from minute to minute. Then heavenly God said to heaven, "Go down where my creatures may reach thee and see thee." So the heaven came down by the power of heavenly God. "Oh, that is heaven," cried all the troops. A furious attack on heaven is now unleashed. Arrows pour into heaven from all directions, but there seems to be no one there. So the commander said to the Lionish-God, "We think that the heavenly God has eloped, and the heaven has been evacuated, for we have not seen any angel living or being killed, although we have entered the heaven by about 5 miles. All the angels began to laugh, and they besought heavenly God that they might be permitted to hurl the aggressor out, but heavenly God replied, "Nay, nay, no, I don't allow you to destroy them. Let them be happy, let them carry on their business, and let them bully me, for they don't understand." This surely is the Zoroastrian Armaz speaking, the god of whom the Menaki Karat says, "Armaz, the Lord, is the most patient. For 9,000 years he sees Ahriman inflict misery on his creatures, yet he does not smite him except with justice and patiently." Like Ahriman's preliminary reconnaissance, Lionish-God's first attack on heaven comes to nothing, but for different reasons. Ahriman returns to the darkness because he realizes he is not yet strong enough to attack. Lionish-God returns because there is no solid food to eat in heaven, and because the provisions he had brought with him turn into camphor. In neither case is anything effective done. It is at this stage of the Zoroastrian myth that Ormazd offers peace to Ahriman, and the same happens in Irradiant. Lionish-God returns from heaven with a captive lion who's really heavenly God's messenger. This messenger is imprisoned, but Lionish-God allows his daughter, Twinkling Starlet, to visit him, and tells her about heavenly God, his power, and his peaceful ways. So she duly reports back to her father and says, "Heavenly God is stronger than the other creators and has authority all over the world. But Heavenly God is a peaceful creator and he likes the other creators, albeit he is able to destroy all the other creators ere long. He says that Heavenly God never wishes to persecute any creature nor any creature at all without any cause. My Father and my Creator, my original desires that thou wouldst make this poor lion free and forgettest about the Heavenly God in heaven. My Father, make a peace between thee and Heavenly God, and let this poor lion go, I pray thee. I am sure Heavenly God will send many gifts for thee if thou wilt make a peace, for Heavenly God is surely willful of the peace." Here again the correspondence with the Zoroastrian sources is extraordinary. Heavenly God offers peace as in the Buddhism, and in addition he offers gifts, the gifts being, according to the Buddhism, immortality and benefit abounding. The offer of peace is, however, rejected, and Ahriman threatens either to destroy Ormazd and his creation, or to cause his creation to love him and to hate Ormazd. So too in Irradiant, Lionish-God issues dire threats against Heavenly God. I keep the strange English of the original to give you some idea of the curious flavor of the book. This is what he writes. "Verily I say unto you, my greatest and highest wrath has been spread into the air. It is floating on air, on earth, and upon where no one knows but myself. It shall not cease unless you be murdered and your heaven be conquered. I shall excuse you no more. Neither shall you reign up in heaven any more, nor shall another creator live any more, but I, who am called Excellence Lionish-God." Give me a second here. Could use a drink. Alright. Again, just as Ahriman claims that he will cause Ormaz's creatures to hate the creators, so it is said of Lionish-God that he has caused the creatures on earth to forget their original creator, who is Heavenly God. He has set the creatures on earth against the principal creator, who is Heavenly God. The exactitude of these parallelisms is really quite astonishing. The next episode in the Bunda Hishin is the compact which Ormazd and Ahriman make together, according to which the conflict will be limited to 9,000 years. In the words of the Bunda Hishin, Ormazd said to Ahriman, "Fix a time so that this pact we may extend the battle for 9,000 years." For he knew that by fixing a time in this wise, Ahriman would be made powerless. Then Ahriman, not seeing the end, agreed to that treaty, just as two men who fight a duel fix a term, saying, "Let us on such a day do battle till night falls." Well, in the words of Menakikrat, for 9,000 years Ahriman made a treaty with Ormazd through infinite time. Until it is completed, no one can change it or make it different. And when 9,000 years have fully elapsed, Ahriman will be made powerless. This treaty is paralleled in Irradiant 2, though the details do not agree. After the first attack on heaven, Lionish-God writes a letter to Heavenly God in which he threatens to destroy him. And his letter is followed by an agreement signed by the creator of Earth, Excellence, Lionish-God. It has 10 articles, none of which, however, exactly correspond to the much simpler Zoroastrian account. The agreement starts in this way. Agreement 1. I shall agree. The war between me and Heavenly God shall continue until Heavenly God be destroyed and the originator of all become one, who I am. There shall never be peace between me and Heavenly God. And the references to I am that I am, interestingly, here. But anyways, he further promises to destroy Heavenly God and to burn up all who continue to worship him. With Heavenly God thus disposed of, my brother devil shall be the judge on the judgment day. 10. Heavenly God shall never be taken out of hell after he has been cast down into it. Admittedly, the terms of the treaty are not the same in the two accounts, but the fact that the treaty reappears at all amounts to additional proof that the strange epic, which is survived purely by chance, is really based on the Zoroastrian myth of the conflict between Ormazd and Ahriman, which probably dates back at least the 4th century BC. Every phrase of the myth duly reappears and destroyed from Liristan. Before passing on to the next episode, it is worth pointing out that Lionish-God, though he claims to be a creator, never claims to have created anything but the earth and all that it contains. He is creator of what is now called the Dunya. He is not, nor does he claim to be the creator of the Alam, or universe. This may well have been the belief of the so-called demon worshippers and of the Roman Thrace, as we shall see in our next article. In the Bunda Hishin, Ormazd and Ahriman have now agreed to limit the battle to 9,000 years. Ahriman attacks again and again is repulsed. Then Ormazd chanted the Ahunvar, and he showed to Ahriman his own final victory, the powerlessness of Ahriman, the destruction of the demons, the resurrection, the final body, and the freedom of all creation from all aggression forever and ever. When Ahriman beheld his own powerlessness and the destruction of the demons, he was laid low, swooned, and fell back into the darkness. Unable to do harm to the creatures of Ormazd for 3,000 years, Ahriman lay crushed. The second defeat of Ahriman surely enough reappears in Irradiant. Lionish-God collects a massive army which he transports to heaven on demons. He reaches what the texts call the resemblance of heaven at midnight. But suddenly a voice came from heaven saying, "O Lionish-God, fear Heavenly God and take your troops back on earth, otherwise you will get trouble." Lionish-God disregards the voice and sends some of his troops towards the sun. Suddenly the same voice came from heaven to Lionish-God saying, "O Lionish-God, you will be faced with danger if you don't take your armies back on earth." Again, Lionish-God pays no attention and bids his commanders to attack. His words to them are worth quoting, if only to give you some idea of the peculiar but charming English in which this amazing epic happens to have survived. "I said," says Lionish-God, "don't listen to that bad voice. Attack from that direction. Get on the ball." Then the voice came from heaven thrice, so loud and strong. The voice said to Lionish-God wrathfully, "This is my last voice. Take your armies back on earth. Fear your God who has given you authority on earth." Lionish-God, however, is undeterred, and he and his troops rain arrows into heaven. Then, after they had shot for 15 minutes, suddenly a little black piece of cloud came over the armies, and it began to thunder quickly. After the cloud had thundered for 1 minute, suddenly one thunderbolt came out among the thunders, and it was explosion. The voice of the explosion of the thunderbolt was so offensive and so strong and so light that the distance between heaven and earth had been lighted like daytime. All the armors had been fainted, some had been died, and some had been death. All the armies began to fall off, coming down from heaven to earth. But the part of Lionish-God's troops who had suddenly gone to the direction of sun, yet they were yet continuing their attacks on heaven from the direction of sun. Suddenly a very little star came out from the sun, and it was burst after it had entered among that part of the troops. A kind of fire came out from the small star. That kind of star was so vigorous that all the part of the troops had been burnt up during 5 minutes. Lionish-God's armies reached 100 miles far from Earth during their fainting. Here the resemblance between the two accounts is quite astonishing. In the Bunda-Hishin or Mazd, causes Ahriman to lose consciousness by chanting the Ahuna prayer. Similarly, in Irradiant, Heavenly God warns Lionish-God 3 times, and his voice is followed by thunder and lightning, which caused Lionish-God to lose consciousness and fall down to earth. The fainting and the falling could almost be a little translation of the Pahlavi words Sturt ut bod used in the Bunda-Hishin. So exactly do the two accounts correspond. Moreover, the Ahuna prayer itself is in 3 parts, each comprising 7 words, and according to the Bunda-Hishin, this is the effect it has. When 1/3 thereof is recited, Ahriman shudders for fear. When 2/3 are recited, he falls on his knees. When the prayer is finished, he is powerless. Thus, the 3 voices mentioned in Irradiant again reflect an ancient Zoroastrian tradition. In the Bunda-Hishin account, Ahriman remains unconscious for 3,000 years. During this period, Ormazd creates the material world as a bulwark against Ahriman when he again attacks. When this 3rd attack at last comes, it is devastatingly effective, and Ahriman succeeds in defiling everything Ormazd has created. First the sky, then the waters, then the plants, the prototypes of the animal kingdom and of man, and finally fire. He has achieved what appears to be a complete victory, and he exultantly exclaims, "Perfect is my victory, for I have rent the sky. I have befouled it with murk and darkness. I have made it my stronghold. I have befouled the waters, opened the earth, and defiled it with darkness. I have dried up the plants and brought death to the bull, sickness to Geomart. I have seized the kingdom. On the side of Ormazd, none remains to do battle except only man. And man, isolated and alone, what can he do?" Whew, man. In his first war against the material creation, then, Ahriman wins a crushing victory. How do matters stand in Irradiant? After a second defeat, which sent him swooning back to Earth, Lionish-God is utterly dejected, not knowing what to do. One night he dreams, and in his dream, suddenly he saw a very beautiful young man come to him. Lionish-God asked him, "Who are you, although I know you?" The young man replied, "I am thy brother devil, and have come to show thee how givest a blow to Heavenly God." The devil then goes on to tell him that he can never conquer heaven or kill Heavenly God, and he counsels him to concentrate his efforts on destroying the true believers. This episode is interesting for the devil. He fulfills the role of Ormazd in the Bunda-Hishin, for in reciting the Ahuna prayer, Ormazd showed Ahriman his own final victory, the powerlessness of Ahriman, the destruction of the demons, and so on. In Irradiant, it is the devil who shows Lionish-God that he cannot hope to conquer heaven or destroy his heavenly rival. The most that he can hope for is to destroy or convert the believers in Heavenly God. So, how and why is it that the devil who gives this truthful advice I shall try to explain in my next article? Suffice it to say that Lionish-God allows the devil's advice, and just as Ahriman does in the Zoroastrian legend, he wins an instantaneous and crushing victory. 2 of the 4 countries which worship Heavenly God are instantly overrun. Their kings, whom Irradiant's father is one, are slain. The population is either slaughtered or converted back to the worship of Lionish-God and his brother, the devil. The countryside is pillaged and wrecked, and the cities are demolished. The wreckage is complete. All this again tallies with the Bunda-Hishin account and with the character of Ahriman, whose will is to smite and whose substance is envy. In both accounts, the evil one's victory on Earth in the material world is instant and apparently complete. But in both accounts, it is really only the beginning of the end, and the counterattack, when it comes, is relentless, as the Bunda-Hishin says. As too did Ormazd know in his omniscience that within these 9,000 years, 3,000 would pass entirely according to the will of Ormazd. 3,000 in mixture would pass according to the will of both Ormazd and Ahriman, and that in the last battle Ahriman would be made powerless and that he himself would save creation from aggression. This chronology of the Bundahishn, which is repeated throughout the Pahlavi text, does not appear in Irradiant except in one passage, but this is a crucial one. After Lionish-God has crushed 2 of the kingdoms of the true believers and slain Irradiant's father, there is a counterattack in which Chandelier, not Irradiant, is the commander. The forces of Lionish-God are expelled, and a great rite is celebrated commemorating the creation. A rite lasting 6 days and called in English the General Origination Days. On reaching this point in the manuscript, I thought that here at least we were going to be told the secret doctrines of whatever sect Ali Mirdrakvandi belonged to. I was, however, bitterly disappointed. 42 pages had been left blank with only this note to explain the lacuna. Notice, it is very difficult to write about what the true believers did during Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Interesting that Friday and Saturday are not part of that. I may have to look into that a little bit more. Yet, despite this maddening lacuna, we do learn that for 3,000 years men will forget to prostrate themselves before Heavenly God. There's surely a dim memory of those 3,000 years which passed according to both Ormazd and Ahriman. I hope that I have said enough to convince you that there exists in the folklore of Luristan an epic which, in its oldest level, is based on the Zoroastrian religious myth of the conflict between Ormazd and Ahriman, God and the Devil. The resemblances are too many and too exact to be fortuitous. When I originally said that there's a second author, it's the same author, I'm sorry, but he just had a part 2 and happened plenty of years later, it seemed. So, as much as my throat is killing me from talking so much. Actually, no, never mind. Oh, this is weird. So, yeah, part 2 is by R.C. Zaehner, but the introduction is by Philip G. Kreinbrock, SAOS, the University of London. I'm wondering if the Zaehner's Source Survival's folklore, this PDF, isn't the whole thing. It's good that it's short because I can do it within possibly 2 hours. But at least you can just freeze frame, read it yourself, mute me, whatever, or just look at keywords and find a PDF. You can download it and read it. You know, a whole bunch of things. But anyways, let me continue on. I'm on page 13 of 23, and and this kind of goes pretty good into a bunch of, you know, let's see where all these stories align and what we can make of it, type of thing. So here we go. The paper published here is based on the last of 2 lectures delivered by the late Professor R.C. Zaehner at the British Institute of Persian Studies in Tehran in the early 1960s on the subject of the long epic story Irradiant by Ali Mirdrakvandi. The first part appeared in Iran 3, the present article, however, was never published and was widely believed to have disappeared. The same was true of the manuscript of Ali Mirdrakvandi's work itself. Most Iranists, therefore, have shelved the Mirdrakvandi question as a fascinating but insoluble enigma for well over 20 years. By pure coincidence, the present writer discovered recently that the Mirdrakvandi papers, including the manuscript of Irradiant and a typescript of the present article, were still in the possession of Mr. J.F.B. Hemming of Falmouth, Cornwall. Mr. Hemming had been Mirdrakvandi's friend and mentor in Tehran in the early 1940s, and it was he who encouraged Mirdrakvandi to write the work. The manuscript of Irradiant is bequeathed to the Bodleian Library after Mr. Hemming's death, but Mr. Hemming so kindly allowed the present writer to keep it at SOAS for an indefinite period of time. I'm going to have to go looking for that. Bodleian Library. In view of the lapse of time since the question was last discussed in print, it may be useful to recall the main facts of the case. Irradiant was written in English by a self-taught man from Luristan, Ali Mirdrakvandi. Mirdrakvandi came from the village of Rayhan, near Dimeshq in Luristan. His parents had been taken away by soldiers and were never heard of again, and he was brought up by his grandfather, who was wild. The grandfather told him the story of Irradiant, where he took the boy on hunting expeditions. Mirdrakvandi, who appears to have a near-obsessive wish to learn English, attached himself to British and American military circles in Tehran in the early 1940s, doing odd jobs for them and asking to correct his English, his special patron being Mr. Hemming. Contacts with the latter began in August 1943. After corresponding a steady stream of letters and short compositions, Mr. Hemming asked Mirdrakvandi if he knew a story he could write down. Thus prompted, Mirdrakvandi began the 600,000-word story of Irradiant in early May 1944. So that's weird, because as far as R.C. Zaehner said, it was 400,000 words, so maybe he didn't get the final act, book 3 or whatever. Well, no, we'll see. But Mr. Hemming left Iran well before Irradiant was completed. An official in the British embassy took care of Mirdrakvandi and saw to it that the rest of the manuscript reached Mr. Hemming in England. When the work was completed, Mr. Hemming contacted SOAS, and eventually Professor Zaehner, who had known Mirdrakvandi in Tehran, took charge of the manuscript. Professor Zaehner was clearly fascinated from the start by the unmistakable structural likeness between the latter part, Book 2 of Mirdrakvandi's work, and the Zoroastrian cosmogony as found in Buddhism and the work of Zaehner. The opposition between Heavenly God and Lionish-God results in an attack by the latter, which is repulsed. This is followed by an agreement between the two powers to wage war until either is destroyed. During this next attack, Lionish-God hears a triple pronouncement by Heavenly God and is again defeated. This defeat is only temporary, however, and the rest of the book describes the long-drawn battle between the two opposing forces until the boy Irradiant, Heavenly God's earthly champion, finally triumphs. Zaehner, who had argued earlier that the lion-headed divinity of Roman Mithraism represented Ahriman rather than Zervan, regarded the evidence of Irradiant as confirmation of this view. Lionish-God is the opponent of Heavenly God. He suffers from after-knowledge, and his role in Irradiant is very similar to that of Ahriman in his Zoroastrian cosmogony. It could therefore be surmised that the lion was a widely recognized symbol of Ahriman. However, as the middle part of the present article shows, such an identification is not without problems. A clear distinction is made in the story between the devil, who is Lionish-God's brother, and Lionish-God himself, who cannot be called wholly evil and is in fact helped mankind to survive in the world. The above description can hardly fail to remind one of the Yazidi divinity Malak Tafs, about whom very similar claims are made. In fact, it is one of the merits of Zaehner's work that he already pointed to the links between the evidence excuse me. In fact, it is one of the merits of Zaehner's work that he already pointed to the links between the evidence of Irradiant, Roman Mithraism, and the mythology of the Yazidis and the Aliak. In his first article on Irradiant, Zaehner announced his intention of exploring these links more carefully, a task he sadly did not live to complete. By a remarkable coincidence, however, Zaehner's second article on Mirdrakvandi has reappeared at a time when such questions are once more being discussed by historians of religion in the light of new insights. In a series of articles, the present writer has pointed to Avestan evidence for the existence of an older pre-Zoroastrian version of the Iranian cosmogony, which bears a striking resemblance both to the cosmogony of the Vedas and, as far as one can judge, of that of Roman Mithraism. Unmistakable traces of this ancient myth can be found, moreover, in the mythology of the Yazidis and the Aliak, and, as will be seen, the myth may well provide a clue to the original identity of Mirdrakvandi's Lionish-God. Like the ancient Indians, the pre-Zoroastrian Iranians believed that the world had been created in two stages. During the first embryonic stage, the prototypes of the creations existed motionless in a confined dark space enveloped by the narrow stone sky. Then Mithra, the primeval sacrificer and lord of fire, came forth from the stone sky and performed the first sacrifice, thus bringing motion, growth, warmth, and light to the earth and creating the world as we know it. The Vedic evidence suggests, however, that at some stage, probably during the migrations, a new ethos became prominent among the Indo-Aryans, which idealized the values of a martial, heroic age, and led to a strong cult of the immoral, warlike god Indra. In the course of time, Indra then absorbed many of the functions of the more priestly divinity Mitra, including his role in the second act of creation. As T. Burrow has shown, it is probable that Zarathustra's people had renewed contact with the Proto-Indo-Aryans. Therefore, the latter conquered the subcontinent. Zoroastrianism may well have been born of the clash between the more traditional worldview of Iranians like Zarathustra and the innovations of Indra worship. As is well known, the final result of this confrontation was that in Zoroastrian cosmogony, an act strikingly similar to Mithra's original sacrifice, which has been usurped in some milieu by Indra, was attributed to the evil Ahriman and was believed to have brought about a fall from grace whose effects must eventually be undone. While Indra became one of the chief demons of Zoroastrianism, Mithra, divested of his creative functions, remained a great Yazada. It is now widely recognized that Zoroastrianism developed in eastern Iran long before it became prominent in western parts of the country, which implies that a pre-Zoroastrian form of the Iranian religion must have flourished there for centuries. Eventually, some sort of confrontation must therefore have taken place between his faith and Zoroastrianism. A major problem in the Zoroastrianization of western Iran must have been the status of Mithra. He was a great god in both religions, but the one that claimed him as divinity whose bull sacrifice brought about the glorious second age of creation, while the other regarded this as a deplorable result of Ahriman's murder of the uniquely created bull. The evidence of Roman Mithraism, which must have been at least partially inspired by a myth closely resembling the one outlined here, as well as the internal evidence of the Iranian tradition, strongly suggests that Mithra continued to have strong popular appeal in western Iran for a long time. At this popular level, however, confusion must have been rife as regards beliefs about Mithra's character, the implications of his creative functions, and his relations with Ahriman. It seems plausible then to assume that the mythologies from Mithraism, which recognizes Dos Ahrimanias, whose origin must almost certainly be Zoroastrian, but attributes pre-Zoroastrian functions to Mithra, the Ali-Haq, which, alongside many Zoroastrian features, contains a positive account of the second act of creation, accompanied by a pact and the sacrifice of a bull, and of the Yazidism, its veneration for Melek Taus, reflect the various permutations of original myth which developed under the influence of such perplexities. The same appears to be true of Irradiant, whose structure, which is clearly based on the Zoroastrian cosmogony, while one of its protagonists, viz. Lionish-God, who claims to be creator of all, who rules over the world and is both good and wicked, shows traits which may well derive from older beliefs. Running out of water too. Invariably, the question then arises how we should understand and interpret all this. Was Mirdrakvandi schooled by his grandfather in the esoteric lore of a known or unknown sect, as Zaehner seemed to suspect, or do the facts admit of a lesser spectacular explanation? Clearly, one can only guess. Mr. Hemming informs me that the question of Mirdrakvandi's original religion was never discussed. Certainly, he never claimed that his story was anything more than that, nor did he suggest that he himself belonged to any special group. But then a member of such a group might well have practiced taqiyya and hidden his religious identity. Two other facts may be more significant. First, while Irradiant shares with the religion of the Ali-Haq its characteristic tendency of reducing the divine beings of old to human size, which gives ancient myths a peculiar sense of immediacy, the autobiographical oh man, I've been talking a long time. The autobiographical aspects of the story seem to take this so far that one can hardly imagine that for the author the tale represented religious truth. If Mirdrakvandi's wild grandfather was in fact an Aliak Kalam Khan, or the guardian of the sacred traditions of a similar sect, he would seem to have inculcated in his grandson remarkably little respect for such precious knowledge. Secondly, one of the main themes of Book 2 is the attraction and eventually a marriage between Irradiant and a daughter of Lionish-God. This theme, that of the union between a new ruler and the daughter of the last king of an old era, is an ancient one in western Iran, but does not appear to belong to the religious tradition. Again, this does not prove much, but it makes it seem less probable that the story as a whole is based on the religious teachings of a sect. It seems more likely, therefore, that in Irradiant we have tangible evidence of the substratum of ancient lore, whose existence has so often been claimed to explain the origins of such sects as the Yazidis and the Alihaq. The intellectual and cultural heritage of a group of tribe which is transmitted, added to, and modified down the centuries, while such lore does not generally have the status of religious knowledge, is so deeply rooted in the culture that in some cases efforts to integrate its truth with that of official religion probably led to the development of new religious beliefs. 2. The text of Zaehner's lecture. Okay, so this goes back to R.C. Zaehner. Alright. In my last lecture, I tried to show how faithfully and how surprisingly the myth of Ormazd and Ahriman, which is basic to Zoroastrian dualism, has been preserved throughout the centuries in the folklore of Luristan. Let me recapitulate the parallelisms. In both the Pahlavi text and in Irradiant, there is an initial attack on the powers of light by the powers of darkness, which fails. Next, the good god offers peace to the evil one who rejects it. Peace having become impossible, the two sides enter into a treaty or agreement which can only result in the total destruction of one or the other. This is followed by the evil one's second attack on the powers of light. And this in turn is defeated by the good god's utterance of a triple invocation, which causes the evil one to lose consciousness and fall, hurling into the depths of which he had originally come. Up to this point, there's almost complete agreement between the two accounts. At this stage, however, there is a difference. In the account of the Pahlavi books, Ahriman can only be brought back to consciousness by the boast of a mysterious character called Je, or Ja, the primal whore, who stirs him up with these words: "Arise, O our father, for in that battle I shall let loose so much affliction on the blessed man and the toiling bull that, because of my deeds, they will not be fit to live, and I shall destroy their dignity. I shall afflict the water, I shall afflict the plants, I shall afflict all the creation of Ormazd." At these words, Ahriman is comforted, his strength is restored, and he delivers his devastatingly successful attack on the material creation of Ormazd. In Irradiant 2, Lionish-God needs comforting before he can deliver his own brilliantly successful attack on the true believers. His comforter, however, is no longer the primal whore, a thoroughly Zoroastrian character, but the devil who is his brother. The devil explains how it is not possible to destroy Heavenly God. The best that Lionish-God can hope for is to destroy or convert the true believers away from Heavenly God to allegiance to himself. Acting on this advice, Lionish-God attacks, wins decisive victory, and proceeds to kill, destroy, and defile everything in the conquered territory, much as Ahriman had done in the Pahlavi books. It seems then fairly clear that whatever the direct source of Irradiant was, it borrowed the cosmic myth of Ormazd and Ahriman from Zoroastrian mythology, but fitted it into a different context. This is no longer the original duel between the two deities that takes place at the beginning of time, but the last stage in the titanic struggle, the struggle that takes place during those 3,000 years, a mixture which would pass according to will of both Ormazd and Ahriman. This is time when, according to Sarashtani, Ahriman went forth and mastered the world. Perhaps it is silly to speak of the theology of a fairy tale, but this particular fairy tale is, in places, thoroughly theological. Excuse me. Here, we have two rival gods, each claiming to be the creator. There is, however, a great difference between them. Heavenly God claims to be the creator not only of heaven and earth, but of other orders of existence, of which both human beings and Lionish-God are ignorant. He also claims that it is he himself who has given Lionish-God authority over earth, while Lionish-God on his side claims to be unoriginated and immortal. He claims to be the creator of the earth, the sea, and all the creatures that are in them. This is not by any means an orthodox Zoroastrian belief, for in some ways more reminiscent of the Gnostic demiurge who creates the material world under the impression that he is the supreme deity and rather makes a mess of it. However that may be, this limited claim of Lionish-God reflects, too, a passage from Buddhism, which is the fall of the Zoroastrian equivalent of the story of the fall of Adam and Eve in Genesis. This is what the Buddhism says. The first thing they, the first human couple, said was this: Ormuz created water, the earth, plants, cattle, the stars, the moon, and the sun, and all fertile things. Then the aggressor Ahriman assailed their mind and corrupted it, and they cried out, Ahriman created water, the earth, plants, and other things. When they pronounced this first lie, which ruined them, they spoke in accordance with the will of the demons. This first joy did Ahriman steal from them and make his own. For this lie both were damned, and their souls shall remain in hell till the final body. What is significant in this first lie of our first parents is that, having first ascribed the creation of all things to Ormuzd, they then, corrupted by the evil spirit, attributed the earthly creation to Ahriman. They do not attribute the creation of the heavenly bodies to him. This theory, which attributes the world and all it contains to Ahriman, and the heavenly lights only to Ormuzd, is precisely the belief of the worshippers of Lionish-God and Irradiant. As far as Lionish-God is concerned, he does not demand faith from the heavenly creatures, or which he admits that heavenly God has supreme power. But he does claim the earth as his own and intensely resents heavenly God's assertion of jurisdiction over it in an attempt of Irradiant and other true believers to wrest it from his grasp. Here, surely we have a survival of the belief of the Devasnan, or demon worshippers, so often attacked in the Vesta and Pahlavi books. What do we know of these so-called demon worshippers? The Persian for demon is div. Middle Persian dev, Old Persian daiva, Avistan deva. All these words correspond to the Sanskrit deva and etymologically connected with the Latin deus. Originally, they must have been gods. In the Avesta, there are two words for supernatural beings, Ahura and Daiva, and these correspond etymologically exactly to the Sanskrit Asura and Deva. In the Rig Veda, the earliest literary monument of the whole Indo-European group of races, both terms mean divine beings, the Asuras being more remote from man, the Devas closer to him. In the course of time, however, the Asuras, who always had an uncanny element in them, became purely maleficent powers, whereas the Devas remained gods similar to the gods of Greece and Rome and other Indo-European peoples. I got one sip of water left. In Iran, however, exactly the opposite happened, owing to the reform of the prophet Zoroaster. No Ahura was any longer allowed to exist in his own right, and Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, was raised to the position of the one true God, maker of heaven and earth and all that in them is. The Devas, on the other hand, were regarded by the Iranian prophet as being maleficent powers, the henchmen of Angra Mainyu, or Ahriman, whose real origins remain obscure. The Zoroastrian reform, however, which pulled an exalted monotheism in the place of the more ancient polytheism, which the Iranians had formerly shared with their Aryan cousins who had moved on into India, this Zoroastrian reform was far too radical and politically too weak to eliminate the worship of the Devas altogether. In what was later to become Zoroastrian orthodoxy, a place was made for many of the old Ahuras like Mithra and Anahita, but not for the old Devas, whose cult was in all probability associated with bloody sacrifice. And it is this cult, in my opinion, which reappears in Mithras' sacrifice of the bull in the Mithraism of the Roman Empire. It seems plain, however, that the cult of the Devas coexisted with Orthodox Zoroastrianism until the reign of Xerxes, when it seems to have been suppressed, at least officially. It remained an underground existence, however, in all probability up to Muslim times, as the constant attacks on it in the Pahlavi books show. The suppression of the cult of the Devas is commemorated by Xerxes in these words. Within these provinces there were places where previously Devas had been worshipped. Then by the will of Ahura Mazda I destroyed that temple of the Devas and I made a proclamation, saying, "The Devas shall not be worshipped. Where the Devas had previously been worshipped, there did I worship Ahura Mazda in accordance with truth and using the proper rite." In the Avesta, the Zoroastrians, or worshippers of Ahura Mazda, referred to themselves as Asavan, followers of truth, and to their opponents or demon worshippers as Dravant, followers of the lie. And this passion for truth has always been characteristic of Iranian religion in general. This emerges from the pages of Herodotus too, who, in describing popular Iranian religion, not Zoroastrianism proper, the most disgraceful thing in the world, they think, he writes, is to tell a lie. Next worst, to owe a debt, because among other things, the debtor is obliged to tell lies. This passion for truth is equally characteristic of the Gathas of Zoroaster, and the inscriptions of Darius the Great is the very hallmark of Zoroastrianism. How do matters stand in Irradiant? Not too well, I am afraid, for throughout this immense story, victory is gained quite as much by strategic deception as by valor. Lionish-God is inveigled into attacking heaven by one of Irradiant's allies on the grounds that Heavenly God has no armies, only several bands of angels, who themselves had no armor, nor could they fight. Similarly, Lionish-God is persuaded to make his second attack on heaven by Chandelier, who first wins his confidence by doing obeisance to him with infinite servility and then gives him a map of heaven, which in the event proves to have no relation to the truth. And as far as the deception goes, Irradiant is, if anything, worse than Chandelier. Nor does Heavenly God appear to be above deception himself, or at least his angels are not, for during Lionish-God's first attack on heaven, suddenly 10 angels appeared before the Lionish-God, and they tied lion with them on their necks. They prostrated themselves before the Lionish-God. The Lionish-God asked them, "This lion is the most beautiful of all. Why have you tied him?" The angels replied, and they said, "This lion is the same Heavenly God whom thou wantest to kill or capture. We have captured him and brought him tied to thee." The tied lion is, of course, not Heavenly God, and admits to it when he is carried off to earth. But Lionish-God realizes that he has been deceived and says, "And why did the angels lie? They said that you were Heavenly God and the creatures in heaven should not lie." The tied lion answered and said, "Yea, the heavenly creatures never lie, but as Heavenly God did not want to disappoint his creatures and wanted to persuade them, and moreover, as he knew that thou wert a foolish Lionish-God, he made some of his angels lie to thee." I will not attempt to explain away this anomaly, although there are many ways in which this could be done. I would simply say that in the story there are innumerable different strands, some dating from very ancient times and some from as late as 1947. It would be foolish to look for a complete inconsistency between the pre-Muslim Zoroastrian tradition and a fairy tale from Loristan, which has now come to light. And yet, despite this lapse, the Zoroastrian detestation of the lie, which in their parlance is simply another word for evil, does emerge later. After the tied lion has proved his wisdom and his power to work miracles by the power of Heavenly God, Lionish-God casts him into prison. His daughter, however, Twinkling Starlet, who was later to be converted to Heavenly God and marry Irradiant, was allowed to visit and question him. "Answer me truthfully, please," she says. "Are you Heavenly God?" No, I am not Heavenly God. Heavenly God has created me, you and thousands of worlds full of creatures. How can I tell you a lie?" This idea is developed a few pages on. The tied lion is offered food by Twinkling Starlet, but he declines on the ground that only heavenly food is suitable for dwellers in heaven. "Heavenly God will send me my daily ailment, which is heavenly food," he says. "Now ask him to send you your daily ailment if you are speaking the truth," said Twinkling Starlet. "I am not hungry," answered the tied lion. "Lie to him and tell him that you are hungry," said Twinkling Starlet. The tied lion laughed and said, "Lies are never used up there in heaven. The creatures of heaven never lie. Moreover, Heavenly God is warned from the hearts of the creatures. He knows when his creatures are hungry and when they need anything." The principle of truthfulness is thereby upheld, although it is realized that not all are strong enough to abide by it. And the principle is reaffirmed by the lion, who is indeed God's messenger on earth when he refused to lie even under duress. "Your father," he says to Twinkling Starlet, "wants me to lie for him, and I never lie." Thus, though in the bulk of the tale the worshippers of Heavenly God are even more addicted to deceit than their enemies, the principle to lie is wrong is thrice affirmed by the tied lion who is God's messenger to twinkling starlet. Much later in the book, the absolute incompatibility of truth and falsehood is affirmed by Irradiant himself, and at the very end of the work, all manner of lies and deception are condemned as mortal sin by the only true believer in the whole book who appears to live up to his own standards. This character, who, along with many other true believers from the West, turns up for the last battle against Lionish-God, was the quite extraordinary name of Western Baal. I cannot, however, seriously maintain that Western Baal has anything to do with Zoroastrianism. He seems to belong to the very latest stratum of this epoch, and his condemnation of a great many things as mortal sin points only to one source. Nobody, as far as I know, talks much about mortal sin except Roman Catholics, and the more recently they are converted, the more they tend to be obsessed by this disagreeable idea. It was in 1946 here in Tehran that I became a Catholic, and it was very shortly after I met Mirdrakvandi. I obviously indoctrinated him more than I remember, and I can therefore confidently say that the views of Western Baal have little or nothing to do with Zoroaster, but they have plenty to do with me. This must serve as a caution, for were this fact not known, Western Baal's detestation of the lie might well have been attributed to Zoroastrianism influence. Yet, despite all this, I am convinced that in Irradiant there is much generally Zoroastrian material. Now, let us take the question of the true believers and the heathens who worship Lionish-God in Irradiant. Let us see that in fact they in fact believe, and to what, if anything, in Zoroastrianism they correspond. The heathen, to take them first, worship Lionish-God as the creator, or at least as a creator, and this we have seen to be characteristic of the demon worshippers of pre-Muslim times. Excuse me. This they do because they believe him to be omnipotent and omniscient in his own sphere, that is, on earth. And they do this out of self-interest, for, as Lionish-God himself points out, Heavenly God is millions of miles away, and for that reason one must suppose incapable of bringing effective aid to his devotees. Moreover, Lionish-God not only claims to be a creator, he also claims to increase his worshippers' livelihood. To give them health and wealth, prosperity on earth, and joy in the paradise as of his brother and master devil, which is down there. Leaving the devil aside for the moment, let us compare this what we learn about the demon worshippers from the Pahlavi books. This at last is not very much, but does tally with what we learn from Irradiant. To start off, they are indifferently called demon worshippers, and magicians, and wizards are very prominent too in the entourage of Lionish-God. The Persian word presumably being fadu, corresponding to Pahlavi yotuk, but are wholly absent from the forces of Irradiant and his allies. Similarly, just as Lionish-God bestows health, wealth, and an increase of livelihood, so we learn from one of the few passages in which the demon worshippers are allowed to speak for themselves. That was just these gifts which the demons claim to provide. Then did we take counsel with the demons. When we crave of them lordship and leadership, they grant it to us, and when we crave richness and flocks and wealth, they grant it to us. Similarly, in another passage, the demons are represented as deceiving men with promises of good life and deathless progress, and by saying that lordship comes from Ahriman. Now I'm going to take a break there because that sounds very much like a lot of systems these days, right? I'm almost done, but I ran out of water, so I don't know whether I should stop or take a break or just keep going. I may keep going and just slow down. It's been an hour 44 and a half minutes, so let's see if I can just struggle on through. Further, they prefer wealth to virtue. All this is equally true of the kingdom of Lionish-God, which is this earth. It would then seem that in the view of the demon worshippers, Ahriman was responsible for dispensing health, wealth, and power because he was prince of this world. This is what Lionish-God claims in Irradiant, and it is to smash this pretension that Irradiant wages war on him. There seems every reason to believe, then, that the worshippers of Lionish-God are the lineal descendants of the demon worshippers of the Avesta and Pahlavi books. Apart from their motives for worshipping Lionish-God, what do these heathens believe? First, they believe that Lionish-God is the creator and originator of this earth, the sea, and all the creatures in them, including man. Lionish-God is continually addressed as, "Oh, my creator." But they also believe in a vague way that there is God in heaven who is invisible and has little or no power over earthly affairs. In this sense, they are as dualist as the Orthodox Zoroastrian dualists. Here are two creators, not one. There is duality from the very beginning, just as there is in the Buddha Shin. And the purpose of the struggle between the two principles is for the one to destroy the other, so that only one creator and one God remains. The aim of both is to unify an original duality, or Maz by promoting growth, which alone can squeeze out the negative principle of violence, and Ahriman by destroying everything that will not submit to him. This idea is amazingly reproduced by Lionish-God in his so-called agreement. The war between me and Heavenly God shall continue until Heavenly God be destroyed and the originator of all becomes one, who I am. So, just as Lionish-God is an authentic successor to the Zoroastrian Ahriman, so are his devotees the authentic successors to the demon worshippers of Avesta. Xerxes' inscriptions and the Pahlavi books. The latter, moreover, worship not only Ahriman but also a plurality of demons. They were in fact polytheists. So too in the first book of Irradiant, before we learn of the existence of Lionish-God, we learn about the fetish houses of the heathens, and the fetishes, probably translating Persian but, are many. Lionish-God then and his followers are both polytheists and dualists. They believe in two principles, and of these they believe Lionish-God to be the ultimate victor. The story of Irradiant proves them wrong, just as the Zoroastrian myth proves that Ahriman must in the end be destroyed. Theologically, the two myths are identical. In the beginning, there are two principles. In the end, there will only be one, since one or the other must ultimately be annihilated. Master Devil, or Satan as he is sometimes called, is rather a shadowy figure in Irradiant, according to one of his devotees. He is more beautiful than Irradiant, and he appears to Lionish-God in a dream as a very beautiful young man. However, he rules over Lionish-God's paradise, for Lionish-God claims to have a paradise as well as a hell. I do not pretend to be able to explain the origin of the supremely beautiful devil who is also the Lord of Paradise. All I can suggest is that he may have been a duplication of the Zoroastrian god, or Mazd. On the one hand, he is Heavenly God who, though a god of peace, is in self-defense of the eternal enemy of Lionish-God. On the other, he is the ruler of Paradise and brother of Lionish-God. The idea of Ormazd and Ahriman being brothers goes right back to the Gathas, our oldest Zoroastrian source, usually thought to have been composed by Zoroaster himself. There we read, "In the beginning, those two spirits were the well-endowed twins were known as the one good and the other evil in thought, word, and deed. Between them, the wise chose rightly, not so the fools. And then these spirits met. They established in the beginning life and death. And in the end, the followers of the lie should meet with the worst existence, but the followers of truth with the best mind. Of these two spirits, he who was of the lie chose to do the worst things, but the most holy spirit, clothed in rugged heaven, chose truth, as did all who sought with zeal to do the pleasure of the wise Lord by doing good works. Between the two, the Davids did not choose rightly, for they deliberated, delusions overcame them, so they chose the most evil mind. Then did they, with one accord, rush headlong into fury, that they might thereby extinguish the existence of mortal men." This, of course, is one of the most classical texts of Zoroastrian dualism, but it will be noted that the two spirits are described as twins, just as Lionish-God and the devil are brothers. Could it be that among the so-called demon worshippers, these two primordial twins were not seen as enemies but as friends? This is not impossible, for read in the Denkart that the demon worshippers propagate the religion of Ahriman in the name of Ormazd. If this is so, then Ahriman would be for them the undisputed ruler of this world, who has power to send people not only to hell, but also to heaven, over which Ormazd, replaced by an all-beautiful devil in Irradiant, rules. Alternatively, Lionish-God and the devil may represent Ahriman and Ormazd, the heavenly god Zervan, infinite time, who in many non-Zoroastrian texts is represented as being the father of Ormazd and Ahriman. For there are at least three types of Zoroastrianism in the Sasanian period. The first, represented by the Pahlavi books, was purely dualist. Ormazd and Ahriman are co-eternal principles of light and darkness, good and evil. Both are eternal and have no origin. There can be no peace nor compromise between them. A second type, usually called Zervanite, basing itself on the passages from the Gathas, which we have just quoted, maintains that the two deities are twins. They must have a common father, and that this father was Zervan of infinite time. We might then try to explain Heavenly God and Irradiant as Zervan, and the devil as Lionish-God as Ormazd and Ahriman. Again, this interpretation, however, must be set the almost exact correspondences between the accounts of the Pahlavi books, which are wholly dualist on the one hand, and of Irradiant on the other, which show that Heavenly God must in fact represent Ormazd. But the Zervanite version of the original and Ormazd and Ahriman seem itself to have been a rationalization of the Gathic passage. Just quoted in that passage is the Holy Spirit and the evil spirit, who are twins, not Ahura Mazda and the evil spirit Ahriman. At later times, Ahura Mazda and the Holy Spirit were identified, but in the Gathas they were not. For in the Yasna, Ahura Mazda appears as the father of the Holy Spirit. It is just conceivable that this idea may survive in Irradiant. Heavenly God corresponding to Ahura Mazda, Master Devil to the Holy Spirit, and the Lionish-God to the evil spirit Ahriman. I cannot pretend that this is more than an intriguing hypothesis, and it does of course leave quite unexplained how on earth the devil, even though he is a very beautiful devil, came to replace the Holy Spirit. And yet, stranger things than this have happened in the history of religion, for among the Mandeans, the Holy Spirit of Judaism and Christianity appears as the source of all evil. Al-Shahrastani, in his Kitab al-Malal wal-Nihal, mentions three types of Zoroastrianism: Orthodox dualists, Zervanites, and a third sect from which maintained that Ahriman or the devil arose from an original doubt or evil thought of God, that is Ormazd. Al-Baghdadi, another Muslim historiographer, who died in AD 1037, also repeatedly refers to Majus or magicians, and so far attributing to them a categorical dualism, declares that they believed that God created Ahriman, and between them they managed the affairs of the world, God only doing what is good and Ahriman doing only what is evil. This would appear to be precisely what the true believers believe in Irradiant, or is this to push the analogy too far? One thing is certain, and that is the true believers are monotheists, worshippers of one God only, who view the devil as being God's original adversary. It is not then much more straightforward to interpret the story of religious war as war between the strictly monotheistic Muslims on the one hand and Zoroastrian dualists on the other. More straightforward perhaps, but not wholly convincing. As I have said earlier, there are several different strata to this epic, the earliest of which seems to be Zoroastrian, and the latest of which are Mr. Hemming, fairly broad Anglican, and myself at the time rather narrowly Roman Catholic. But whereas these last two strata are easily recognizable, and whereas the resemblances of the Zoroastrian myth, if not the Zoroastrian doctrine, are very striking indeed, there is surprisingly little in this huge work that is specifically Muslim. Only two passages strike me as being undoubtedly Muslim in origin. The first is when, after Irradiant's first victory, his chaplains, the word no doubt dates from the Hemming period, explain the true nature of the devil to the conquered heathen, whose generations have been worshipping the devil from the old years. There are some embellishments, but the core of the story comes to the Quran. This is the story as it appears in Irradiant. The devil was a worshipful creature before the human race had been created. He had seriously been worshipping God for 1,000 years, so God had made the devil the president of a few thousand angels. When Adam was created, God said to all his angels and other of his creatures, "Prostrate yourselves before Adam." So all the angels and all the other creatures prostrated themselves except for the devil, who did not prostrate himself before Adam, and moreover spat in Adam's face. This is not from the Quran. God said to the devil thrice, "Prostrate yourself before Adam." But the devil would not accept, and he replied, I shall never bow myself down before Adam, for he is made from dust, and dust is the lowest thing. So God sent him to hell, but in return for his past service, he granted him access to the human heart and life until the day of judgment. All this comes from the Quran and later traditional teaching. I'm out of water. So too, at the end of the 6 days feast called the General Origination Days, pictures of Adam and the great devil are produced. The first is treated with the greatest respect, while the second is pelted with mud and stones. This, of course, recalls Satan's epithet Al-Rajam, the stone, which occurs twice in the Quran, and the ceremonial stoning of him, which forms part of the pilgrimage. Apart from this, there's nothing in the whole huge story which would disclose that the author was even nominally a Muslim. In our last lecture, we saw that Heavenly God does bear a close resemblance of the Zoroastrian Ormazd in that he patiently endures the injuries that Lionish-God inflicts on his creatures and tries to inflict on himself. He is never angry and neither beats his creatures. Lionish-God's anger, on the other hand, is constantly mentioned. Indeed, no anger like the anger of Lionish-God had been found in history. Now it is just this that the Pahlavi books and particularly the Shikand and Gomanik Vakar being up against the Islamic God. He is more like Ahriman than he is like the good God Ormazd. Like Ahriman, we read, his anger with a single one of his sinless servants destroys and leads astray countless numbers of his own creatures. Or more strongly still, the Muslim God is more evil and more sinful than Ahriman himself. This is certainly not true of Heavenly God of Irradiant. He is primarily a God of love and wishes happiness even to Lionish-God, although he knows he will never repent. Moreover, he is invisible and a pure spirit. He is never spoken of in anthropomorphical language as in Allah of the Quran. Unlike Allah, who, according to the tradition, will be seen in heaven, the Zoroastrian God can never be seen by the beatified. Thus, in the book of Arle Viraf, which describes the journeyings of that Zoroastrian Dante throughout the various hells and his final emergence into the presence of the All-Highest, we read that Ormazd spoke to him, and though he heard his voice, he saw no physical form. When Ormazd spake in this manner, I was astonished, for I saw a light, but no body did I see. A voice I heard, and knew that this was Ormazd. Similarly, Lionish-God hears the voice of Heavenly God, but neither he nor anyone else can ever see his form. It is in the episode of the Tide Lion, which Lionish-God brings down from heaven, and the dialogue that takes place between the lion and the Lionish-God, that Heavenly God's resemblance to the Zoroastrian Ormazd is most clearly seen. In other passages where the attributes of God are described, they might equally refer to the God of the Sufis or the Christians. This is particularly marked in those passages in which the true believers explain the nature of the one true God to the conquered heathen. I have little doubt that the emphasis which the author puts on the love of God is due either to Sufi nor to indigenous Christian influence, but to Mr. Hemming, who often talked about religion and particularly the Christian religion, to Mirdrakvandi. The reason I say this is that right at the end of the book, we suddenly come across an unspoken Trinitarian formulation of the deity, in the name of the God, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Not absolutely right, but as near as you could wish. For this, I myself must take all the blame. If then Mirdrakvandi derived ideas of the Trinity and mortal sin from me, then it is more than likely he derived the idea of God as substantial love from Mr. Hemming. It is then most difficult to disentangle what seem to be genuine Zoroastrian ideas of the deity from those which Mirdrakvandi imbibed from Mr. Hemming and myself. One passage, however, appears to be genuinely antique. It occurs just before the 6 days feast of the General Origination Days, in which there appears to be the head of whatever sect Mirdrakvandi belonged to, opens the ceremony and speaks about God. The head of the sect bears the extraordinary title in English of the High Pope. I have no idea what the Persian for this can have been, and for all I know, I may be responsible for this too. Be that as it may, at a point when I thought we were really going to learn something about the beliefs of the sect, the manuscript breaks off at page 1000 with demanding but candid confession written in block capitals. The remainder speeches of the High Pope have been forgotten. This does not indicate that at this point at least Mirdrakvandi was reproducing to the best of his ability what had been handed down to him by his grandfather. The terminology, however, is so Christian that I think whatever the grandfather actually said, it must have been reinterpreted in light of what Mr. Hemming had said to him so much more recently. This God is essentially a God of love. He is lover, helper, comforter, and redeemer. The last two terms almost certainly derived from context with Christian, and his kindness is infinite. God is hundreds and hundreds of times more kind to us than our fathers are. You are very kind to your children and to your brother. You like them exceedingly while they live on this earth. But when they die, you will be sad for them and will weep for them. But your sadness for them will last only 2, 3, or 10, 20, or 50 days, or 2 or 3 months. Then you will forget them. Yeah, you will forget your brothers and your children after they die, and you will not like them like before. Their lover, helper, comforter, and their redeemer in God who likes them all the time. He is with them while they are upon this earth, while they are into the tomb, while they are up there in heaven, and while they will be everywhere, wherever they may be. All this sounds thoroughly Christian, as is the idea found elsewhere in the book, that the Spirit of God, once it has been received, cannot be taken away. This well might originate in Sufism or even Zoroastrianism, as we shall see later. Yet even the High Pope's description of God may derived from Mr. Hemming rather than from an older tradition. His account of God's creation of the world is, so far as I know, unparalleled. The world, it appears, was created in 6 days as in Genesis and the Quran. In the Zoroastrian books, it was also created in 6 stages. But God's creative plan was more conceived of in precisely half a minute. Yet to be more precise, it was conceived of between 3 o'clock and 6 minutes and a half minute past this midnight until 7 minutes past midnight. In commemoration of this, the Feast of the General Origination Days begins at 6.5 minutes past 3 a.m., and to ensure that it begins at exactly the right time, the High Pope has a watch which he repeatedly looks at before the ceremony begins. Here we have perhaps the strangest feature of this really extraordinary book. Ancient myth and the modern world mingle with each other in the most natural possible way. Let's see how much. 4 pages, really. 2 pages. Alright, I'm going to try to finish this because I went this far. Excuse me for my burping and my dry mouth. Gosh, I wish I had some water. Alright, everyone of any standing has a watch. The army commanders have telescopes, there are banks, newspapers, typewriters, and identity cards, but despite all this, the hardcore of the story remains ancient, and the modern embellishments are, I am almost sure, entirely due to what I can only describe as the genius of Ali Mirdrakvandi. These additions are, of course, easily recognized. What is not so easily recognized is just how much purely Christian material has been inserted into an originally Zoroastrian setting. In my opinion, the great emphasis on the love of God is due to the direct Christian influence of Mr. Hemming. It may also owe something to Sufism. However that may be, it is not typically Zoroastrian, for love is about as characteristic of the Zoroastrian or Mazd as it is of the Allah of the Quran. It is there, but is rarely specifically mentioned. Mazd is rather a god of righteousness, truth, and goodness. Certainly he loves his creatures, but this is not an aspect of him that is all emphasized as it is in Christianity. For the true believers, God is one and the creator of all things, including Lionish-God. This, however, does not mean that he is the Muslim Allah, since Orthodox Islam accepts the physical characteristics, say, while denying the face and hands of God are comparable to human faces and hands. It asserts that they are nevertheless a face and hand in some sense, though in a sense that would be presumptuous for human reason to try to fathom. For the true believers in Irradiant, however, God, though omniscient, has nothing that is comparable to our physical organs. Like the Zoroastrian God, he is pure spirit who can never be seen, who can be heard. The true believers' minimum creed is given in an ultimatum which they send to the heathens during one of the wars they wage against them. I shall quote the relevant parts, though this time I shall have to alter Mirdrakvandi's English in places for the sake of clarity. This is what the true believers say. All you heathen nations must know that Heavenly God has created you. Not only has he created you, he has created all the worlds and all the things which are in them and on them. Verily we say that we are not your enemies, but we are your friends. We have not come to kill you, neither have we come to take your goods and your money from you, nor have we come to deceive you like Lionish-God does. We have only come to show you and hold out for your consideration your original creator, who is Heavenly God. have been deceived, so we are very, very sorry for you. Lionish-God says that he has got all that Heavenly God has got. Heavenly God can never be seen, but he sees everything. His Holy Spirit is in the heart of his creatures. He has no eye, but he sees all the doings of his creatures. He has no tongue, but if he speaks, all the worlds will hear his voice. His voice is not loud, that it should deafen the worlds. It is very soft, but has a sound that all the worlds can hear. But Lionish-God is not so. All people can see him, even cats and dogs can see him. Lionish-God cannot find out what is happening unless he asks. He eats and drinks all the time like Madame One-Who. I have no idea what this can possibly mean. While your original creator, Heavenly God, never eats and never drinks, Lionish-God sleeps on his godly bed at night time, like a tired pig. He doesn't understand what has happened in his godly country until his people tell him in the morning. Whereas your original creator, Heavenly God, never sleeps. He takes the best care of all his worlds. Lionish-God is exceedingly angry, sometimes like an intoxicated Quaramon. But your original creator never gets angry, nor does he ever smite his creatures. Some of his creatures are persecuted, their own bad deeds have accused it. Your original creator, Heavenly God, has prepared two places for all his creatures. One is called heaven and the other place is called hell. If you want to go to hell, worship Lionish-God. But if you wish to go to heaven, up to heaven, you must have faith in your original creator and your father, Heavenly God. And you must kill Lionish-God. Faith in Lionish-God is unfirm and likened to a glass which of a sudden will be broken. But faith in Heavenly God is likened unto a sharp sword which will be able to scarify the hardest metals and the hardest rocks. Therefore, by this thing that is faith in Heavenly God, we will deliver you from the filthy hands of Lionish-God. Again, all this again is Zoroastrian rather than Muslim. Worship of Ormuzd, Heavenly God, leads to heaven. Worship of Ahriman, Lionish-God, leads to hell. But it is the Zoroastrianism according to al-Baghdadi, denouncing the Zoroastrianism of the Pahlavi books. God is the creator of all things, including Ahriman, and between them they manage affairs of the world, as al-Baghdadi says. Similarly, in Irradiant, Heavenly God bids Lionish-God, fear him who has given you authority over earth. The reference to the Holy Spirit which indwells the hearts of all creatures may date from the Hemming period. I rather doubt it. The idea occurs elsewhere in the book and may be genuinely Zoroastrian. If so, it would correspond to the indwelling of the believer's soul in the body by vomit, Avestan Vahumana, the good mind, which is reasonably common in the Dankar. Again, the description of heaven in Irradiant is Zoroastrianism and not Muslim. Not much is said about it, and what said seems to be contradictory. This is what the captive lion tells Twinkling Starlight about it. In the world on which I have been created, one does not eat or drink, neither work, nor is there any season for us, like day, night, spring, summer, nor any other season. I don't say that we don't eat. We do eat and drink, but we don't urinate and excrete. We eat a kind of food that the creatures of earth have never seen, nor will they ever see such nice food. We don't buy food, nor do we work, but Heavenly God gives us our food any time that we are hungry. Heavenly food, of which the Christians know nothing and which the Quran mentions but does not emphasize, is for the Zoroastrian the first of the delights of heaven experienced by the soul of the saved. Then do they serve him with the sweetest foods, even the butter of the early spring, so that the soul may take its ease after 3 nights of terror at the bridge of judgment. What appears to be a contradiction in Radiant, in heaven one does not eat, yet one does eat food which is immediately supplied when one is hungry, is perhaps a clumsy attempt to reproduce the idea we find in the Pahlavi books. In heaven one only eats for pleasure, not to satisfy want. For heavenly food differs from our food on earth. From earth we either eat because we are hungry, or we eat for the pure pleasure of it. In heaven, the pleasure motive is alone present. Despite the many close parallelisms between Irradiant and the Pahlavi text, it must not be forgotten that religion depicted in Irradiant, where Lionish-God is the legitimate ruler of the world, is nearer both to Gnosticism and to Mithraism than it is to the orthodox dualism we find in the Pahlavi books. This is shown particularly in the attitude death expressed throughout the book. In the Avesta and the Pahlavi books, death is a scourge inflicted on the world by Ahriman, who is himself called full-on death. And total salvation can only be achieved once soul and body are reunited. In Irradiant, on the other hand, death is the greatest of God's gifts according to the heavenly books, though it is later said by the purest Western Baal that life and death are both happiness gifts. Yet the idea that death is a mercy is not entirely un-Zoroastrian, as some mourning for the dead is considered sinful. And in Irradiant, the Queen of Perlia, one of the earliest true believers, and the wife of Chandelier, reproved excessive mourning over the dead and boasted that she herself did not weep at her father's death. One last brief point before I finish this long list of parallelisms. Between the Zoroastrian books and Irradiant. In the former, hell is situated in the north, and so too in Irradiant. It is in the north that Lionish-God's kingdom is situated. And now I hope that, though you may have been bored, you will have been convinced that so many and such close resemblances cannot be due entirely to coincidence. Much still needs to be done, and I am delighted to say that a pupil of mine has accepted the very considerable task of disentangling the various strands that go to make up this mighty epic. We are fortunate in knowing that during the writing of this work, Mirdrakvandi was influenced first by Mr. Hemming and secondly by me, for the mortal sins and the incongruous appearance right at the end of the work of the Holy Trinity. I must accept responsibility, and Mr. Hemming is almost certainly responsible for the emphasis put on the love of God throughout the book. What is far more puzzling, however, is the mixing up of modern equipment, the medieval and purely mythical material. This, I would think, is entirely due to Mirdrakvandi himself, and how skillfully he does it. There seems nothing incongruous in one of the last scenes where Twinkling Starlet, having fallen in love with Irradiant, having been converted to worship of heavenly God, and having whom turned completely against her father, Lionish-God, whom she no longer acknowledges as creator, and whom she now execrates as pig, dog, monkey. Which is interesting because it's part of the constellation, zodiac, right? Or not the zodiac, the Chinese zodiac. Sorry. Is there a monkey? I can't remember. Sorry. I'm tired. Alright, so we too find articles from American camp life filtering into the story. Shoe signs, cans of meat and tobacco, and of course Coca-Cola. And there are accretions from Iranian civilian life, police stations, chiefs of police, a labor office, the national bank, banknotes, and identity cards. The press too is very much in evidence. Journalists are summoned to hear official announcements, which are then distributed by newsboys, while the following words constantly recur: journalists, newsboys, gazettes, newspapers, and the press itself. So intimately does the modern fit into the ancient that we even have a news hag, hags being a species of non-human being who travel through the air at incredible speeds. Again, tobacco plays an important part throughout this story, and this is, I think, not an innovation of Mirdrakvandi, since two of the most important characters are addicted to it. Lionish-God himself, who is addicted to cigars, and Crazy Hero, whom we meet at the very beginning, and who stays with us until the very end, and who is badly addicted to pipe smoking. Indeed, the whole character of Crazy Hero, who is Irradiant's bosom friend, centers around his craving for tobacco. It is possible, of course, that Mirdrakvandi made up Crazy Hero himself, but this is difficult to believe because in the first aggressive war of Irradiant against Lionish-God, it is Crazy Hero's furious powers that saves Irradiant from total defeat. He is part and parcel of the story. Moreover, he has a very definite character of his own, surely taciturn and bad-tempered, but deeply attached to Irradiant. Moreover, unlike any other characters, he positively dislikes religion and is utterly bored by all the pomp and ceremony of the general origination days. I would be inclined to think that perhaps in the 18th century there lived another Mirdrakvandi with as lively as imagination as Ali, who introduced Crazy Hero into the story and supplied Lionish-God with his cigars. Be that as it may, there is one very strange discrepancy in the story. While on the civilian side of life we have everything from tobacco to Coca-Cola, from the national bank to identity cards, on the military side we have nothing that is post-medieval. The weapons are bows and arrows, swords and spears and clubs. And there are horses but no chariots. Air transport as in in Solomon's day by demon or hag who, as everyone knows, had the power to fly through the air. There is not a trace even of gunpowder, let alone all the weapons that Lionish-God must have seen in the American and British camps in which he worked. Why this should be, I simply do not know. There are many other problems that this fascinating work presents us, but I have only time to touch on one. The proper names. We are fortunate knowing that Irradiant's real name is Mirdrakvandi and Chandelier's Jahel Chirag. For most of the others, we are completely in the dark. Some are translated and go easily back into Persian. Crazy heroes presumably Pahlavan-i Devane or Pahlavan-i Majnun. Heroine girl Daktar-e Pahlavan, Perlia, Keshavari, Dor, and so on. Others are recognizably Persian, such as Aladdin, Abad, Elias, Ethiop Sadi, Kagan, Jausin, Kabir, Chengiz, and Khuzad. There are also proper names which seem to mean neither Persian, Turkish, nor Arabic, such as Kamli, Kamalis, Argon, Pregau, Dartunek, and Kechi. For these I can offer no explanation at all. These are only a few of the problems raised by this extraordinary book. As a scholar, I would have been preferred that the work had come in my hands in Persian rather than English, and that it had been transmitted by someone less imaginative and less inventive than Lionish-God. But even so, I find the work, as it stands, not only fascinating for the similarities it shows of Zoroastrian mythology, but also fascinating in its own right. The story itself is astonishingly well constructed and in detail. There's much that is really beautiful, and there is wealth of imaginative writing. One gets bored, of course, as one does in all true epics with the endless battles, but suddenly one's attention is arrested by some totally new and unexpected episode. Then there's the fascination of Mirdrakvandi's English. Though grammatically it is far from perfect, the mistakes, though often very comic, are almost always felicitous. Some of his phrases seem to me so much more graphic and correct than correct English. So it seems to me that Lionish-God was beyond anger, is more vivid than Linus was exceedingly wroth, or in more modern English, Lionish-God was exceedingly angry. And infinite grateful is somehow much more expressive than infinitely grateful. Without knowing it, Lionish-God has produced a near masterpiece, and it would be a great pity if the British and Iranians between them did not make it their business to publish this epic saga, which is something really new and original in Iranian letters. There's so much I would like to say about this book, but this has, I hope, been enough to convince you that here we have a vast saga, which is of the highest interest both because its earliest stratum is Zoroastrian and because it is in itself a folktale of the very first order. Poor Ali has rendered this all a service about which he will probably never hear. Alright. Whew, I am done. So I want to make sure I do a search for the Bodleian Library, and on 14th, people was Dr. Christopher Shackel, now professor of Urdu at SOS. But the work in question does not ever seem to have been fulfilled. That sucks. So we may never see the light of day for Irradiant, the full story. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this. This was taxing for me just because I'm tired and I ran out of water and my throat is hurting because I'm trying to finish this this thing. What's interesting is I wonder if there's more to it. I don't think so. I mean, the reason why I'm wondering is because like we have these page numbers that start with 87, but I think it's just a one of those published works where different people have different different parts into that published book. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this. There's gonna be probably more to this as I search for more things, but for tonight, that's it. Thank you for joining me and have a good night.